So where I wanted to start with is the components of a golf shaft. Can you list out the components of the golf shaft so we kind of have a foundation for the rest of the conversation?
Yeah, sure. When we're looking into kind of base level golf shaft design parameters, there's really four. So weight, it's an obvious one, 40-gram driver shaft, 130-gram iron shaft, and everything in between. Torque, which controls the twist both during the swing and also at impact. Flex, which is the short Twitter version is designed to how strong the golfer is, whether it's a regular flex or stiff flex, but there's a lot more complexity and nuance to that conversation that we can get into. And then launch, which in the new era of fitting has become much more important. People need shafts that launch higher, launch lower, control their spin, increase their spin, help their stopping power. So those are the four primary characteristics when we're designing a golf shaft that we look at.
It's interesting because on that list, and one that a lot of folks had questions on, and maybe it's more of a fit, it's a product of fitting and not actual manufacturing, but shaft length. When you guys are designing shafts, the shaft length come into play on that?
Well, we generally always, like, a driver shaft is always 46 inches, where the length comes into a fitting standpoint is obviously the first one is how tall the golfer is you got someone who's 7 foot versus someone who's 5'1", there's going to be some length differences there. Although I will tell you that iron shafts on the PGA Tour, 99% of those guys who have a varying amount of height are playing shafts within no more than a half-inch difference, plus or minus a quarter from what we would call standard length. But obviously with an amateur golfer, you get a lot of different kind of swing shapes, people who are very upright, bent over, people who are very bent over. So we always build the shafts are usually 2.5 to 3 inches over length to what the final length of the golf club is. And then, that leaves room for the fitter too. If they need to make the shaft a little bit stiffer, they can take some off the tip. If, they want to make it fly a little more, they could, even install a 3-iron shaft into the 4-iron and do things like we call hard and soft stepping to manipulate launch and spin. And so that's where you need the extra length. If you move a longer shaft into a shorter club, or sorry, the other way around. If you move a shorter class into a longer club, which is called hard stepping, you need a little bit of extra length there to cut off and get to that final finish length.
It's one thing I've toyed with, right? It's the length of my driver, and I had an old Grappolo that went to like 47.5. What's the legal limit? 48?
The legal limit was 48. It is now 46, but I believe that is a local rule. So like if you're playing in like a mid-am type, a high level USGA event, they have the limit. If you are playing just, your normal Saturday game with your boys, 48 is still the legal, but 46 is the new max. But like I said, I believe that's a local rule confined to upper level competition.
Yeah, I better be careful if I try to pull that thing back out, but I'm on the hazardous now.
Not that there's bifurcation in the rules at all, but there is a local rule that says you can only play at 46 inch in certain levels of competition.
One game across the board, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's funny because someone told me that I was that I wouldn't necessarily lose distance. This is a fitter, a friend of mine, that said, you're not going to necessarily lose distance if you go with a shorter driver if you do the fitting correctly. And he brought up the example of Sergio, who I think has doesn't he have like a 43-inch driver or something, Sergio?
43.5, I think. Yeah.
That's wild, right? And so he's like, just make sure, test the numbers to it. And I definitely picked up accuracy when I went to the shorter hazardous. I play the hazardous green now, and it's probably standard, but the accuracy is there, and I don't think I lost any significant ball speed.
I think the thing, especially for as you move away from the very low single-digit handicaps, or even some single-digit handicaps who just aren't consistent with the impact with the driver, if you go to a shorter driver, it helps you hit it out of the center of the face. Your average driving distance is probably going to increase. A lot of people get on a launch monitor and they just look at the one drive that they hit the farthest. And so they're like, wow, man, I really squared that one up and I, hit it 15 yards farther. But then if you look at the dispersion, it's like, well, I got 40 yards of front to back dispersion on 6 swings versus the other ones at front to back dispersion of 20 yards. And that average was a little farther forward. So I think a lot of people could actually benefit, especially mid to high handicaps, from playing a little bit shorter driver. So you hit the center of the club face more often, because the club's going a lot faster, but you smash it off the hosel, it's not going to go very far.
Yeah, yeah. Center of the club face is kind of trumps the other
Yeah,
stuff. Is it?
it's
And what
certainly like heel to center to heel trumps an extra inch or inch and a half of shaft length.
what about last length question for you? Single length clubs, right? You know, you got Bryson making it popular, and how when that started as a trend, what happened internally at True Temper? You guys like, all right, we already have tested, you know, something existing on these single length clubs for the iron set, you know, through the
Yeah,
bag, or like what was your guys' thoughts there?
it's an interesting one. We actually worked. I actually personally, I met Bryson when he was still an amateur. He wanted to talk about shafts, and this is actually right as he had signed with Cobra. So it was actually turned out to be a good deal for me. We were at the Memphis event, and it was the week before the U.S. Open, and he just signed with Cobra, and he wanted to talk all about shafts. And so the guy who was running our tour division at the time comes over and he's like, "Hey, Bryson wants to meet about shafts." I was like, "Sure, just let me know when." He goes, "Oakmont next Tuesday, 3 o'clock at the house he's staying at." So meant I got to go to Oakmont for the practice rounds of the U.S. Open, which was a pretty cool last minute, not cheap trip to all of a sudden go to the U.S. Open on, I think was 6 days notice. But so I worked with him really extensively there, and then spent a week at Cobra in their fitting studio working with him, to the point where I had to finally be like, "Hey, can I just get a Cobra badge so I can get through the lobby back to the bathroom and then back to the fitting studio?" So I have to ask somebody to walk me back there every time. But the thing with a lot of the single length stuff that they had to overcome is, especially at the top of the bag, it kind of is like your 4 iron, your 5 iron, your 6 iron all end up going a similar distance, just on different trajectories for a lot of amateurs, especially mid handicappers. So it becomes a shaft question of, you got to do something with the shaft to help 4 irons, 5 irons get up higher in the air to get that extra carry when you're swinging everything at the same length and you're just altering the loft of the club. So we did some work on that. We don't just candidly, we don't make a lot of the shafts that go into the single leg sets that are out there in the marketplace, but that's kind of some of the things we had to look at when we were potentially working on those programs.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating. You can't tell if it's a fad or not. Do you think it's a
Yeah.
fad? Do you think it's something that has legs?
I think there's certain people it works for. I got a good buddy who been playing golf with him for 30 years. And he hits driver, man, I'll say 25 times in a round. Like driver off the deck is, and he'll hit driver off the deck like 110 yards. He just likes, that's like a little punch shot, a lot of short par threes. Nothing more annoying in the world when you miss the green with a 9 iron and your buddy steps up and hits a little bunt driver 121 yards onto the green. But he had one club he loved, and so I got him a set of single length irons to mess around with. So I think there's a certain population that it can work for, but I think for new golfers, if you learn that way, it's something you can work off of. I think if you've got a lot of experience with a 5 iron that's 3 inches longer than your sand wedge, I think that would be a hard thing to relearn.
Yeah. Let's move to weight, because this is another area that I think I've personally screwed myself up in the past. I think so. I remember having a 75 or 72 or 75 gram driver that I just loved. I think it was the old like Titleist J head in it. Maybe I updated it with the R, but both were heavier shafts, and started to try to chase some speed. This is me as a more naive younger man, but trying to chase some speed and seeing my teammates playing 60 gram shafts. And so I went down to a 60 gram shaft, and I remember in my driver, it was like it was just a bad move. Like
Yeah.
it really screwed me up. And at that time I thought lighter would be faster, right? Is lighter faster, Don?
Lighter is technically faster because you can move. I guess that we're going to do total club mass 500 grams faster than you can move 515 grams in theory. Like, it's no different than if we put you on a bench and we gave you a 140-pound barbell and a 135-pound barbell. You can move the 135 one faster because it's lighter. But there's a lot of things that come with that there. And the other thing is, like, you're not swinging all out every time you go. So if you think about when you make a golf swing, especially for a better player like you're probably moving your hands at the same rate of speed regardless of what driver I put in your hands, unless we give you 100 something gram difference. So for a better player, you're not, if you're swinging your hands, whatever, 80 miles an hour every time, which leads to 140-mile-an-hour club head speed. Unless you take the lighter club and then actively try to swing it faster, you're not going to notice a difference. Now, a lot, higher handicaps, they are kind of swinging at it as hard as they can every time. Or if it's you and you're like, I want my out of my shoes ball to go farther when I hit that one, that's where the lighter weight can come in. But if you're, like again, like a better players with a controlled swing, you're not going to see a huge difference from going from 75 to 60. Now, it might affect your tempo because, the energy you got to put in to start at the top is going to change with the difference in weight. And obviously, throwing off your tempo is a bad start to a good golf swing. So that's, again, where people are going to see more of the difference. It's just the static weight in your hands as you're waggling it. And, if you're standing over the ball and the club feels heavier, that's going to make you think you have to swing it harder.
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes me jump to the next component, which is flex, because I've always struggled with fittings. I think when I knew what the flex was in my club, does that make sense? Like there's a swing speed and a tempo that I've always, I don't know. I can hit a regular club or like you put a hickory in my hand, for example, which has more softness to it feel, and I'm just going to swing at a different tempo. And so I always struggled with that in my head of like, how's this fitting going to work? Cause I'm changing my swing. I know I'm changing my swing, but like, let's just jump to flex. Like what is the biggest impact on flex to the golf shot?
So flex is, I mean, it really is how much you load the shaft and how much energy you're putting into the shaft and then getting back out of it. It also is a tempo or a feel thing. Like if somebody's a very smooth, even tempo, like they can have a lot more variation in flex without noticing. Whereas if you're really aggressive from the top and you get something that's loose, you're going to feel the club lag and you're going to try to make a correction in the downswing. To it. Or if it's really stiff and you like to feel the head move, you're going to, snap your wrists and try to get the club head moving forward. So, but again, like if you see really smooth swingers, like Freddie Couples, I think famously had like a 3-wood with a ladies flex shaft that he bought in a bargain bin somewhere that he could hit just as far as he could any other 3-wood because he was so smooth that didn't matter to him. But, flex is a lot about finding the right fit for performance, but also feel for you in the downswing. So, so you don't feel like the club's whippy because that always leads to bad things. The Graphiloid fitting motto is always play the softest flex you can control. So, if you ever gone out with a ladies flex shaft, it feels, when you center it up, feels like the ball's going forever. But when you're at the driving range with that, you also hit some over onto the freeway and some onto the parking lot, and, potentially the guy standing next to you. So, a quick rule of thumb is play the softest flex you can control.
So then is it like, I'm trying to think of some different tempos, but you got Freddie, super smooth, and then, a Nick Price, right? Who is like what do you call that at the top of the swing? Is that the load or is that
the load or the transition? Yeah.
Yeah. That transition point it comes quicker, right? So he's going to have a much stiffer flex than Freddie.
Yeah, and it just because he's got the club's got who can't, if he played the ladies flex that Freddie would play when he started that downswing, the club would bend so much and get so out of plane that he would, especially a player like him's going to feel that and try to compensate for it. So
it's a funny thing because I feel like it's a big ego driven thing in golf, right? You're the stiffness of your, and I can't, like, this happened recently where someone was just, digging through her bag. We're waiting on a par 3. They're like, oh, you swing pretty hard. You don't play an X. It's like kind of like what? You can't handle an X shaft? And I was just
there's definitely a ton of that. Like so we have that, the shaft you're playing, I think is the Hulk, the smoke green, the green PVD with the blue, very cool looking golf shaft, way out of my league. And even the regular flex is too stiff for me. I have some advantages I have in the job I have is I have a batch of the shaft I play done up with the green PVD with the blue tip Hulk cosmetic. So I can look like I'm playing the Hulk and have the cool cosmetic, even though I'm playing the mid-launch, mid-spin 60-gram shaft. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You guys should sell that. Call it the ego package. You can get it doctored up if you need to look good at the club. Yeah. Flex. That's interesting. Is there, I guess we've got torque and launch left. There's more questions I want to get to, but let's start with torque. Give us like the kind of the main pieces that people don't think about when it comes to the torque, which is a huge factor, right?
Well, torque is a huge factor, especially in feel. And torque always is kind of, it's one of those things that sets the price of a golf shaft in a lot of cases. People are like, oh, that shaft's 3.2 degrees of torque, it's more expensive, which it is more expensive to make a low torque shaft. But if you made a really good golf shaft that was 5 degrees of torque, the super gearheads would turn their noses up like, oh, 5 degrees of torque, that's a cheap shaft. And the analogy I always kind of make is like, think about like the high-end Mustang that's like 450 horsepower engine in it. It's like, but you're just driving to the grocery store, man. You don't need 450 horsepower. You're not going to get out of third gear. So it's a little bit of that, like where horsepower is what people pay for when they're buying a car, even if they're never going to take advantage of it. So torque is really about feel. If you're someone who misses the center of the face a lot, and you hit it in the heel a bunch, like lower torque's going to make the shaft feel bad. It's going to feel harsh. It's not going to, feel good at impact. Conversely, if you hit it out on the toe a lot and you have a high torque shaft, it's going to feel like the face is whipping open and you're going to be flaring it right. But the thing is, we've done a bunch of high speed tests. We made a like 3x long drive shaft with 10 degrees of torque and hit it out on the toe with 180-mile-an-hour ball speed. And the face literally spun open 90 degrees. So the face was 90 degrees to how it started. But the golf ball is 30 yards down range before that club face twists a tenth of a degree. So it would feel like that's going to shoot the ball way off to the right. But in fact, the ball is already long gone by the time the club face starts twisting open. So it does have some effect on things like closure rate and how fast, where the face angle is at impact. But at the end of the day, it's not affecting the ball flight nearly as much as anybody thinks it might. And in fact, if you hit it in the center of the club face, the club doesn't twist at all because the force of the impact is going directly through the center of the mass of the driver. So there's no twist in that instance. The club just moves straight back. And so in theory with that, if you're hitting it in the center of the face every time, or you gave it to a robot, the robot wouldn't care what the torque was because you're hitting in the center of mass every time.
And so that's the fourth component being launch. It launches definitely the like more buzzword now of anyone that's kind of chasing speed, right? Is that get your launch right? What's your launch angle? With all the sims that our members we go to now in the wintertime, we're always looking at that. Like, oh, look at that launch. And what is good launch? For the individual player, like what is good launch?
Well, and good, it's optimum launch. Like, and you can go find this. I don't have it in front of me, but do a Google search, and a couple of the launch monitor companies have this out there. What's good launch and spin for me is not going to be good launch and spin for you, and what's good launch and spin for you is not going to be good launch and spin for Keith Mitchell or any of these other guys with 190-mile-an-hour ball speed. Although I hear you're a pretty good player, so maybe you're in the Keith Mitchell range, but
not anymore.
But it's different for everybody. Those, but in general, with the driver, higher launch, lower spin is better. And it also depends on the kind of player you are and where you're playing. Like, you see a lot of people have a club and without looking numbers, like, oh, I'm hitting this too high. But if it's someone who never hits a fairway, like all you should be concerned about is how far you carry the golf ball. Because if the golf ball is landing in the rough every time, it's going to land and stop. If you're someone who's landing in the fairway every time, then you're like, okay, this is going to land in the fairway and I'm going to want some rollout. So it depends a lot on the golfer you are. I don't hit a ton of fairways. So all I'm worried about is how far the ball is going to fly. Because that's, for me, carry and total distance isn't much different. If you hit a lot of fairways, my dad doesn't swing it really hard, but he never misses a fairway. For him, a little bit lower landing angle and which comes to the lower launch angle is important because he's going to get a lot more rollout on those shots. So that's one thing is you got to know your game. You're like, hey, don't ever hit the fairway. Okay, I'll launch it high and carry it as far as you can because you're never gonna get that rollout, or you're gonna get the rollout on 3 holes and you're gonna get stuck up in the rough on 11. So on those 11 holes, it's gonna help you to fly it farther.